to this land, I make explicit Indigenous peoples' presence and rights to self-determination. The link between what we're recognizing in the land acknowledgement and what we're here to talk about this afternoon is a pretty clear one. As the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations so poignantly said in a Security Council session last week, questions of invasion and imposition of another state's will on another continue to be front and center. The invasion of Ukraine and the use of force by one country against another is an unequivocal violation of international law. And yet that's where we find ourselves today, because there are so many questions. And so we've assembled a panel today to help us understand not only what's taking place, but what the structures of international law and order tell us about the legality of the invasion and what can be done. Our three speakers are all researchers affiliated with the TJ Center here at Western, and in alphabetical order, let me briefly introduce them to you now. Marta Ditchok is a professor of history and political science. She's a fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and adjunct professor at the National University of the Kyiv Omilia Academy. She specializes in the politics and history of Ukraine and Russia, Eastern Europe, with a focus on post-communism, mass media, and migration. Ryan Liss is a professor of law. His research focuses on criminal law and public international law, including international criminal law, international human rights law, and international humanitarian law, examining the ways in which human rights construct and constrain power. Valerie Oosterveld is a professor of law and the associate director of the TJ Center. Her research and writing focus on gender issues within international criminal justice. Before joining the Faculty of Law, Professor Oosterveld served in the Legal Affairs Bureau of what was then called the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, where she provided legal advice on international criminal accountability for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Now, throughout today's session, please feel free to send me your questions using the chat or by email to tjcenter@uwo.ca, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. We've gathered some questions ahead of time, and I'm going to jump right in to ask Professor Oosterveld, what does international law have to say about the use of force by one country against another? Professor Oosterveld?
Thank you very much, Professor Quinn. So I'm going to begin with the fact that following World War II, the drafters of the United Nations Charter agreed to outlaw the use of force by one country against another country, except in very limited circumstances. They adopted Article 2, Sub 4 of the United Nations Charter, and it prohibits member states of the United Nations from using or threatening force against each other. And I'll just tell you what it says. Article 2, Sub 4 says, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. The prohibition on threatening or using force by one country against another country is also part of customary international law, and indeed it is the highest form of customary international law called Jus Cogens law. So what does this mean? It means that Russia has violated the United Nations Charter by entering Ukraine and continues to violate the United Nations Charter every moment since. And indeed, there have been violations prior to this with respect to Crimea. The United Nations Charter provides only two exceptions to this prohibition on the use of force by one country against another. And those two prohibitions are, firstly, if the United Nations Security Council has authorized collective military action under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, and in this case, no use of force has been approved by the UN Security Council, so this exception does not apply. And the second exception to the rule prohibiting the use of force is if a country is acting in self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Russia has tried to make the case that it's acting in self-defense, but it does not meet the legal tests. In order for it to be able to act in self-defense, Russia must have been a victim of armed attack or an imminent armed attack. and its self-defensive actions must be proportional and only taken if necessary. The facts do not support any of these requirements. However, they do for Ukraine, which does have a right to self-defense. And in fact, under international law, Russia seems to have committed aggression defined under the UN General Assembly's resolution on aggression in 1974 as the invasion or attack by armed forces of a state on another state's territory and the bombardment or use of weapons, amongst other means. And I'd like to make two more points with respect to international law, and that is that the violation of the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force has been accompanied by violations of international humanitarian law and of international human rights law. So international humanitarian law is the area of international law that governs the means and methods of warfare, the weapons used, where they're used, and who and what can be targeted and cannot be targeted. Both Russia and Ukraine are parties to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, the heart of international humanitarian law, and also Protocol 1 to these conventions. And the most fundamental rule of international humanitarian law is that parties to a conflict need to distinguish between combatants and civilians must not be the deliberate target of attacks. What this means is that parties to a conflict need to take all feasible precautions to minimize harm to civilians and must not conduct attacks that fail to discriminate between combatants and civilians or cause disproportionate harm to the civilian population. So this means that targeting civilians, their homes, and crucial infrastructure is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Using weapons with wide area effects like cluster munitions in populated civilian areas results in indiscriminate harm to civilians, which is illegal. And this, unfortunately, has been documented in Ukraine by Russian troops, by international non-governmental organizations, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. They have documented the use of indiscriminate weapons that have hit hospitals and civilian areas. And just on one last point on international humanitarian law, cyber warfare that violates international humanitarian law is also illegal. And the last point I'd like to make in answer to your question, Professor Quinn, is that international human rights law also applies. And the right to life, liberty, and security of Ukrainians has been violated by Russia. Both Russia and the Ukraine are party to a number of international human rights law treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And yesterday, 71 UN special rapporteurs and experts issued a statement decrying the violation of the UN Charter by Russia and expressing deep concern at the human rights violations stemming from the Russian invasion. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Oosterveld. Over to you, Professor Liss, with the next question. And this is in line with several of the questions that have come in on the chat, which has to do with the response of the Security Council and the General Assembly of the United Nations. The United Nations plays an extraordinary role in all of this. And some people are wondering questions about the veto and other things in the Security Council. Over to you, Professor Liss.
Yeah, thanks very much, Professor Quinn. And so Professor Oosterveld has told us about the kind of various international obligations that are at play here, including most fundamentally the obligation to refrain from the use of force by another state. This is perhaps the most foundational international rule of the modern international legal order. But this leaves the question of how we actually enforce this rule. What responses actually exist under international law to address violations of the prohibition on the use of force. And that's where the United Nations comes in, where these two bodies that you referred to, Professor Quinn, the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council, come in. So the prohibition on force is foundational to our international legal order now, but that wasn't always the case. This is something of a recent development. So before 1928, it was perfectly legal under international law to use force. In fact, this was how states actually enforced the law amongst themselves. But this changed with the adoption of the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, and it was crystallized in 1945 with the UN Charter. The prohibition on force became kind of the foundational norm with the UN Charter. And the UN Charter was supposed to do something special. It wasn't merely meant to outlaw force, but to provide a framework to replace it with something else, and that was collective security. And so the UN Charter was meant to say that war by one state against another was illegal, and that the UN will do something to enforce that rule through force if necessary. And there are two organs of the UN that have some role in doing so, and that's the Security Council and the General Assembly that I just mentioned. And as we heard from Professor Oosterveld, the primary entity empowered to maintain peace and security is the UN Security Council. So this council of 15 members is empowered to respond to breaches of the peace by any means necessary, including authorizing force. So what has the Security Council done so far? So on February 25th, US and Albania brought forward a draft resolution condemning Russia's actions as a violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter and demanding a stop to the force. Now, this resolution was ultimately voted down. So the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which includes Russia as one of those members, each have a veto over non-procedural votes before the council. And Russia, unsurprisingly, voted against this resolution that the US and Albania are putting forward. China, another one of the permanent 5 members, along with India and the UAE, abstained from the vote. Now, because of the way that the resolution was actually drafted, there's actually a question of whether it was in fact legal for Russia to exercise its veto in this case. And I'm happy to say more about that in questions, but there's kind of an extra nuance here that might be worth talking through. So thus far, the Security Council has failed to act, at least failed to act in issuing a binding resolution. So this brings us to the General Assembly. So the Security Council is not the only entity with responsibility over peace and security. The General Assembly has secondary responsibility to address matters of peace and security when the Security Council fails to act. And that's what's happening now. So the Security Council called for an emergency session of the General Assembly to address the Ukraine crisis. And in doing so, they invoked a resolution from 1950, what's called the Uniting for Peace Resolution, which calls on the Assembly to address matters of peace and security where the Security Council has failed to act because of a veto, a situation just like this. And this is something of a big deal because that's only been done a handful of times since the UN was created. So that's where we find ourselves now. And the emergency session began yesterday and is ongoing today. And the likely outcome will be a resolution condemning Russia's actions, most likely, and possibly, and this is what is yet to be seen, calling for some sort of collective action, including the possibility of sanctions by Russia. Now, unlike the Council, the General Assembly includes all members of the UN, each with an equal vote. So there's no possibility of a veto at the General Assembly. But in another difference from the Council, the Assembly can only issue recommendations. Formally, it can't require any state to do anything, although there's some arguments about the ways in which it can, and again, we can chat about those in questions. So because it can't authorize coercive action, like the use of military force, formally, the Assembly can only call for peacekeepers or any kind of military force with the consent of the territory affected. So in this case, Ukraine. So we'll see any moment now, probably this afternoon, what the Assembly ultimately ends up doing. But the basic thought here is that it's likely to issue a resolution condemning these actions, possibly setting out some collective actions to be taken, and possibly setting out the first step of what might be further actions to be taken by the Assembly. So thanks very much, Professor Quinn.
Thank you. Professor Ditchok, here's a question for you. There's a lot of questions coming into the chat, by the way, and please keep them coming. Send your questions in the chat to me. We'll try and get to as many as we can. Professor Ditchok, here's one for you, which is, what are you hearing from your colleagues on the ground in Ukraine about what is taking place?
Professor Quinn, thank you so much for organizing this. Over the past week plus, I've been getting a lot of emails and phone calls from colleagues, former students, current students, friends offering their support, asking me how I'm doing. And you, Joanna, you said, I'm organizing a panel. Are you in? So thank you so much for doing that, because that is precisely what a lot of Ukrainians are doing. They are just reacting and defending themselves. And what I would like to do is share this picture with you. This is Max, or I should say, Dr. Maxim Syazhintsev, who has recently defended a PhD in the history department at the University of Western Ontario. Some of you in the audience might know him. This is a photograph that he sent me yesterday. He is right now in one of the territorial, sorry, I'm going to start crying. He's in one of the territorial defense units in Kyiv that is being surrounded at the moment. He is wearing a bulletproof vest, which he didn't have when he signed up for the territorial defense unit, but he posted this yesterday on Facebook saying, hey mom, look, I'm wearing a hat. So he hasn't lost his sense of humor. He's one of the people that I've been in touch with, well, since he left Canada. He defended his PhD, went back to Ukraine, which is where he's from, couldn't go to Crimea, where he was born, where his mother lives, since it's been annexed. He and his wife, who has a PhD in biology, and their little boy, they moved to Kyiv. He started revising his dissertation for publication, doing conference presentations, applying for postdocs, and then this all happened. So what did he do? He went and volunteered for the territorial defense, having no military experience. Before that, he was very concerned about his wife and their little boy, who's not quite 2. So I was in touch with them to help her with an evacuation plan. And the first night of the bombing, she was writing to me from the bomb shelter the next morning. She succeeded in getting her suitcase and their little boy into a car, and they drove out of the city. So they are now in safety. A few other people that I wanted to just mention who also have a relationship with our university, and I just want to pull them up. A number, can you see that? These are people who you can follow. You can follow Max on Facebook, by the way. A number of people who I've, over the years, invited to be guest lecturers at our universities. Any former students in the crowd will recognize these faces. They came and gave lectures in my courses on Russia and Ukraine, politics and media, spoke at the history department seminar. You can follow all these people on Facebook. This is Professor Serhiy Kvit from the University of the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. This is Professor Oleksiy Harain from the University of the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. This is Professor Mikhailo Vinnytsky from the also University of the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And this is Kirill Lukyarenko from Hromadske Radio Public Radio Ukraine, who I've been cooperating with. I'm showing you all these people because when you write to me and say, what can I do to help? Well, you can reach out to these people. These are people who have been at our university, and you'll notice the 3 professors are all from one university, University of the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And in the past, Professor Kvit and I had worked on building institutional relations between our 2 universities. And while Ted Hewitt was VP International, we actually made a lot of progress. And we set up student exchanges at the undergraduate level. We were in the process of doing it at the graduate level, dual degrees, but then leadership at the top changed and our university kind of pulled out of it. But this might be a time to renew those institutional links. So if anybody in the administration is interested, I would be very happy to work on that again. But in the short run, what I'm hearing from colleagues, friends, both in academia and in media, is they would like you to know what's happening, and they don't want you asking them questions. So when you write to these people, you can follow them on Facebook or Twitter. Just reach out to them and say, hey, I'm thinking about you. Is there anything I can help you with? So offer your help if you are so inclined. There are a number of agencies that have set up ways of concretely helping Ukraine, either through donations. So I'm going to provide a list of those to Professor Quinn, who has kindly agreed to disseminate them through the TJ Center, and anybody in the university can access that through there. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about was information, because that's what my research is on. And Joanna, should I just go ahead about that now, or should we wait till the second round? Okay, so dissemination of information is crucial at this time. And this is not only my area of research, or one of my areas of research, but I have also been working part-time as a journalist with colleagues from Hromadske Radio Public Radio Ukraine. And as you all know, part of this situation that we're seeing, which people call Ukraine crisis, but it's not a Ukraine crisis, it's a Russia crisis. And part of this is an information war that Russia has been very successfully launching against Ukraine for not weeks, not months, but years. Because this didn't start a week ago. This didn't start in December. This started in 2013-14, when Ukrainians were about to sign an association agreement with the European Union. And their then president traveled up to Moscow, met with Putin, came back and said, oh no, we're not going to do that. And that erupted in protests that ended up toppling the government. And immediately after that, Russia annexed Crimea and started this hybrid war in the Donbass, which it has been perpetrating for the past 8 years. And the escalation that happened starting in December and really a week ago is a continuation of a long process. But I follow international media and I write about this, and it's been called the Ukraine crisis. Now, why is this the Ukraine crisis when Russia has been annexing its territory and attacking it? And I'm working on a paper, and Matt Lebo, if you're in the audience, this is going to one of those journals that you've been encouraging me to send it to, is looking at why the international media has gotten the Ukraine story so wrong for so long. Because for the last week or so, it's now called Russia's war against Ukraine. But that's been the story for the past 8 years, but it's been called the Ukraine crisis. And there's 3 reasons that I argue why that is. The first has to do with mental maps. The second has to do with Russia's powerful disinformation machine. And the third has to do with the structure of the global communication system and the 24/7 news cycle. So I don't have time to give you a big long lecture on all of this, so I'll just very briefly, mental maps. Most people don't know a whole lot about Ukraine. And that's partly because the way history is taught. Students in the audience, how much have you learned about Ukraine in your European history courses? Probably not a whole lot. And if you did hear about Ukraine, if you didn't take my courses, they were in the context of Russian history, and probably from a Russocentric perspective, which is, here's the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, and it's presented as a monolith, very often not even noting that there are many nations within it. So that's the mental map people are walking around with. So when Putin says Russia and Ukraine are the same, that's pretty much what you heard in your history courses. The second thing is we're still suffering from the legacies of the Cold War, and a lot of people see the world still in that bipolar ideological way that Russia and the US are enemies and antagonists. So when Putin says NATO enlargement is threatening Russia's security, people will say, oh yeah, that's true, because that's what the United States does. The fact that this has nothing to do with NATO, that this is really about the EU and Putin's grandiose plans, people will still will still sort of take that on board. And that's the second point, the Russian disinformation machine, which is extremely sophisticated and powerful, has been constructing these narratives that sort of play with these mental maps. So when Putin says Crimea has always been Russian, if you don't know any better, and the maps that you've seen of the Russian Empire include Crimea, you might actually believe that that's true. Whereas in fact, Crimea became part of Russia as a result of imperial conquest in 1782, which is what the Crimean Tatars call the first occupation, and 2014 is the second occupation. And when another trope is that Ukraine is full of fascists, and these fascists are threatening Russians and Russian speakers. There are fascists in Ukraine, but there are fascists everywhere. Let's look back to the protests in Ottawa where we saw Nazi flags in front of our parliament. So what Russia's machine is doing is they're taking images of, for example, the Nazi symbolism on Parliament Hill, cropping it and saying, look, Canada is full of Nazis. Or what they're actually saying is Ukraine is full of Nazis. A third trope that they're presenting, and again, people are responding to this, is that NATO is threatening Russia. And a week ago, I had a pre-interview with a CBC journalist who posed this question to me: is there any validity? Maybe Russia should be concerned about NATO encroachment on its, and I paused, and then I gave her a long lesson about NATO-Russia relations starting in 1994, when NATO and Russia was one of the first countries to sign a partnership agreement with NATO. And then they set up a special relationship in 1997. As late as 2002, when Putin's already the president of Russia, they are building relations with NATO. So this narrative that NATO is threatening Russia's security is not an accurate narrative. And Ukraine in all of this, Ukraine's open door to, or NATO opened its door to Ukraine in 2008 by saying, maybe potentially someday we will consider including you. And Ukraine hasn't really been moving on that because public opinion in Ukraine is divided on this question. And so this narrative that Ukraine is about to join NATO and NATO is enlarging, this is again a completely constructed narrative, because in fact the issue is about the EU, because that's where Ukraine was actually about to go, and they have signed the association agreement. And those of you who follow the news carefully will see that Ukraine's President Zelensky, who by the way is a superstar, is signing. Yesterday, he signed an official request to the EU saying, please admit us. So that's where the story is. So those narratives that Russia has been constructing, some of you may have been actually taken in by that. And that's because the way the 24/7 news cycle works and the way the global media systems are, journalists don't have time to fact check, and they don't actually have time to do a lot of background. So they get a press release, and these students of mine in the politics and media course will know this. A lot of journalism has turned into what media scholars now call journalism, where they simply take press releases or other prepackaged or something off the wires and they send it off. They don't have the time to check what the story is, and they just put things out there, very often repeating these narratives, which then cause a distorted picture. I have a feeling I've been talking too long, so I'm going to pause there. And I don't know if there's any questions, but I just wanted to thank for that explanation about the legal side of things, because that is so invaluable. And I have certainly learned a lot from listening to the two of you, so thank you.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions coming in the chat, and Dr. Titchuk, you just answered some of them on the question of NATO. So thank you. Keep sending your questions in on the chat, and we'll see what we can do to answer as many of them as we can today. There's a plan afoot that we might try to answer some more questions in a different format, so stay tuned. Professor Liss, I'm going to come back to you now. There are questions that have been raised about the International Court of Justice. So over the weekend, Ukraine filed a case against Russia in the ICJ. What does that mean?
Great. Thanks very much. And this actually picks up in some very interesting ways about on sort of how Russia's misinformation campaign is actually turning against it in a potentially important way. In addition to the responses to Russia's actions that are taking place through the UN and through sanctions by states and groups of states, there are two international court proceedings that are in their early stages. And one is at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, which I'll say a word about. And the second is at the International Criminal Court, which I believe we might touch upon later. And so the International Court of Justice is the UN's primary court, and it hears disputes between states directly. So unlike the International Criminal Court, which addresses complaints or criminal cases against individual accused, the ICJ is about disputes between states. So the ICJ is where one state brings another to hold it responsible for a violation of international law and seek some remedy for that violation. But unlike domestic courts of most states, the International Court of Justice is not a court of general jurisdiction. It doesn't simply have jurisdiction to hear a case on the basis of a violation of international law. Its jurisdiction is entirely grounded in consent of the states involved. And this consent can come through a variety of means, including what's called a compromissory clause. And so a compromissory clause is a provision of a treaty between the states involved that says that if a matter of dispute ever comes up under this treaty, whatever that treaty happens to be about, the parties agreed to take that dispute to the ICJ to address it. So they consent effectively in advance to the court's jurisdiction on a matter within the four corners of the treaty. And through some pretty clever legal arguments, that's precisely what's happening here. So on February 26th, Ukraine started a case in the ICJ against Russia, and they're aiming to base their jurisdiction in one of those compromissory clauses, specifically in one in the Genocide Convention, a treaty which both Ukraine and Russia have ratified. And so the basic argument here is that Russia is acting in violation of the Genocide Convention by claiming that Ukraine has engaged in a genocide of ethnic Russian peoples in Ukraine, and that Russia has tried to justify its right to intervene militarily on this purported claim of genocide. So the argument is by Ukraine that by wrongly invoking the Genocide Convention, when a genocide is not actually taking place, as the basis for military force, Russia has violated that convention. And so there's jurisdiction, they're arguing, to hear this case before the ICJ under that treaty, under that compromissory clause of the treaty. So what is this leading towards? Well, Ukraine is asking the court to grant provisional measures, and this includes requiring an end to the military action. And they're also requesting long-term remedies in the actual case, such as a declaration from the court that no genocide has actually taken place, so a direct response to try to counter this misinformation, as well as guarantees of non-repetition by Russia of action like this, and monetary damages for the harm that's been caused. So as the ICJ's jurisdiction is so limited, the arguments for why the court has jurisdiction over a particular case, often on the cases that come before it, can be a bit of a stretch. Trying to fit a dispute into a context that doesn't really fit within the four corners of the treaty that's at issue. But the argument that Ukraine is pursuing here seems like a pretty clever one, and one that I think has at least some plausibility to be the basis for jurisdiction, at the very least for a grant of those provisional measures that I mentioned, if not for a hearing on the dispute itself.
Thank you very, very much. That's the International Court of Justice, which deals with disputes that arise between states. Professor Oosterveld, I want to ask you about the International Criminal Court, which deals with situations that may overlap the boundaries of a state or where a state may intervene, but deals with individual criminal accountability. And the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has been very active in recent days. Professor Oosterveld, can you tell us, there was a statement issued, for example, on Friday about the war in Ukraine. What is the prosecutor of the ICC saying? What's he doing? What's the latest?
Thanks so much, Professor Quinn. So the ICC's prosecutor has issued two statements, and I'll just tell you a little bit about what was in each and then what it means. So on Friday, this past Friday, the ICC's prosecutor, Karim Khan, expressed increasing concern over the events unfolding in the Ukraine. And what he said was, quote, "I remind all sides conducting hostilities on the territory of Ukraine that pursuant to the declaration lodged on 8 September 2015, this is a declaration by the country of Ukraine, accepting jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, my office may exercise its jurisdiction over and investigate any act of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes committed within the territory of Ukraine since February 2014 onwards." And then he said, "Any person who commits such crimes, including by ordering, inciting, or contributing in any other manner to the commission of these crimes, may be liable for prosecution before the court. And he ended by saying, my office has received multiple queries on the amendments to the Rome Statute, that's the foundational treaty of the International Criminal Court, with respect to the crime of aggression. So the ICC has some jurisdiction over aggression. And he mentioned that the application of the amendments on aggression, because people have been asking him if they applied in this situation, he says that given that neither Ukraine nor the Russian Federation are states parties to the Rome Statute, the court cannot exercise jurisdiction over this alleged crime in this situation. So on Friday, he indicated he's keeping an eye on the situation in Ukraine with respect to genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, but that he does not have jurisdiction with respect to aggression. He then issued another statement yesterday indicating that he has decided to proceed with opening an investigation into the situation in Ukraine as rapidly as possible. This is a step up from what the ICC prosecution office had been doing before, which was a preliminary examination into events in the Ukraine since 2014. By opening an investigation that allows the prosecutor to be able to eventually issue warrants of arrest and potentially actually have cases of individuals before the ICC. Now, Ukraine, I mentioned just earlier, is not a state party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, but it has twice exercised its right to legally accept the ICC's jurisdiction over crimes committed on its territory that fall within the Rome Statute. And he concluded, the prosecutor concluded, that based on his past preliminary examinations about what has happened in the Ukraine since 2014, that there's a reasonable basis to proceed with this investigation. He's satisfied that alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed in the Ukraine in the past, and that given the conflict in recent days, he will investigate whether any crimes that fall under the ICC's jurisdiction have been committed on the territory of the Ukraine. So what this means is that the prosecutor could issue warrants of arrest for those who have committed crimes against humanity and war crimes on the territory of the Ukraine. The big challenge, of course, is that Russia is not a party to the ICC statute and therefore does not have a duty to cooperate in this case. And as Professor Quinn and Professor Liss pointed out, the ICC tries individuals, not countries, and therefore there is the question of whether it would be able to get to get an individual who is the subject of a warrant of arrest physically into custody at the ICC in order to face trial. But this is a challenge for the future. Thank you, Professor Quinn.
Thank you. Just before, I have a series of questions for Professor Ditchok, but before we go there, there've been a couple of questions in the chat, and I want to go back to Professor Liss just for clarification. So in your last comment, you talked about Russia not being able to potentially vote in the Security Council. Why? What does that mean? What the heck?
Yeah, so this entails going a little bit international law geek for a moment. So follow me down the rabbit hole. But as I mentioned earlier, all the permanent 5 members of the Security Council have the right effectively to veto a non-procedural measure before the Security Council. Now, there's an exception to that, and that exception is found in Article 27 of the UN Charter, which says that in certain cases, states should abstain from voting if they're a party to the dispute. Now, that wouldn't apply if the kind of original language that the US and Albania had put forward on the resolution was at issue, because that resolution was originally going to be about under what's called Chapter 7, the UN Security Council's kind of coercive authority, its most significant power to issue a resolution that actually binds states. But because of some last-minute negotiations with China, the Albania and the US reduced the kind of the binding nature of the resolution, and they ended up issuing the draft resolution under Chapter 6, which calls not for coercive measures, binding measures, but for peaceful measures for pacific settlement of dispute, basically consensual steps between the states. Now, by shifting the resolution to be one under Chapter 6, it ended up coming within that exception where a state should abstain from voting against a resolution if they're a party to the dispute. So this has been something that a couple of the states before the General Assembly debate today have brought up. Liechtenstein and others have mentioned that, technically it might have been inconsistent with the UN Charter for Russia to veto this particular measure.
Thank you. Okay, Professor Ditchok, there are a lot of questions both in the chat and that we received ahead of time asking about misinformation, disinformation. We heard the Prime Minister talking about not allowing RT and other channels to be broadcast in Canada. But we also hear that the media that is available in the English language, especially in Canada, seems very, very different than the media that's available in other places. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit, Professor Ditchok, about spin, what you're seeing in media in both languages, for example. What's happening? Is the media spin disinformation campaign effective? What's it doing? How does it work?
Lots of questions there. I'll try to stay focused because I think we're going to run out of time soon. Canada's media coverage, I would put it in the category of Western international media coverage, which is diverse because you have, if you look at the United States, you have different reporters on Fox News and on CNN. They're taking different perspectives, some of them repeating Russian narratives, some of them challenging Russian narratives. What's happened in the past week, 2 weeks, is that a lot of Western spokespeople, so leaders, have been calling Russia out on their misinformation campaign. So that is a positive development. But then there's also the question of how do you actually get accurate information given the 24/7 news cycle and the globalized system that I was talking about. So I wanted to point our audience at what I consider to be the best English language news source that is based in Ukraine. It's called the Kyiv Independent. It's journalists who set this up just recently. And I just actually, while I was listening, was checking the latest on what happened because Kyiv's transmission tower was bombed. And so they've actually were able to restart that. Another place that has really good objective news is Hromadske Radio, Public Radio Ukraine. They're a Ukrainian language radio outlet. They are doing their best to, I don't know if you can, if I've shared the screen, anyway, I'm not sure what you're saying, but if there's anybody in the audience who is bilingual Ukrainian English and want to help them with translations, I'm sure they would appreciate that. So you can just write to them. The other important part of this whole thing is the cyber warfare, which is quite scary. And Russia has been using cyber warfare as one of the tools in its hybrid war arsenal since 2014. Ukrainians have been talking about this because they've been on the receiving end, and other neighbors of Russia like Estonia and Georgia. The world sort of perked up and started listening in 2016 when the United States became victim. And then they started saying, oh, this is serious. We need to do something about this too. And the questions are, how effective are they? And the short answer is they can be extremely effective. And what has happened in the last little while is Ukraine has been trying to fight back because they've been on the receiving end of these attacks, as have been other countries. Canada actually was attacked not too long ago. So I don't know where the initiative came from because I'm seeing two different sources, but there's this article that I came across that the cyber army grows and they're flocking to Ukraine. And from what I gather, because this is just something that I've started following carefully, is Russia has a whole army of people fighting in this cyber war. And all of these digital partisans, this article calls them, they're flocking to help Ukraine. So this is kind of, in my mind, paralleling what's happening in the military side. You've got this Goliath and this little David. Again, any hackers, any geeks in the audience, this is where you find your information and get involved. Now, was there another question that I forgot? Because I'm following, as we're talking, like friends of mine are writing to me in chats in Ukraine saying, okay, I think we need to evacuate because the bombs are starting to.
It's crazy to think that that's where we're at. I think we're good for now, Professor Ditchok. I do have another question. We'll see how far we get. I have a question now for Professor Oosterveld, but I'll open it also to Professor Liss and Professor Ditchok, which is about global war. So we know that wars are civil if they operate within the boundaries of a particular country. We know they become global in scale once they flop over the boundary of a particular country. And in this case, it's an incursion, an invasion by another country onto the sovereign territory of a particular state. People are asking in the chat, there's quite a lot of questions related to this, about the escalation of that. So people are asking about whether NATO has some kind of responsibility to help Ukraine. Ukraine isn't a member. Whether European Union countries have some kind of obligation. Questions about how far this is likely to escalate, or whether or not there are some kind of additional consequences that could be applied or enforced to dissuade a bigger conflict from growing. Professor Oosterveld, only because it's your turn, I'm coming to you. Do you have any thoughts about this? And then Professor Ditchok, maybe I'll come back to you.
And Professor Liss, you might also have some thoughts. The first and foremost thought is just to remind everyone that the way in which we need to think about this is through the lens of the UN Charter. So if other states become involved, they are still bound by the need to not use force by one country against another country, except in response to, or except through the two exceptions that we talked about. Now, it is unlikely that there will be an authorization through the UN Security Council for collective military action. And therefore, the only way through is with respect to self-defense. There has been talk, of course, in recent days of whether Russia would stop with the Ukraine and whether it would continue onwards into other countries, which then may raise the right of self-defense within NATO countries if a NATO country had been invaded. I don't know, Professor Liss, if you had any other legal aspects to add.
Sure, yeah, just to add to that, to kind of pick up on that last part, the structure of NATO is as a defensive alliance in particular. And so Article 5 in particular of the NATO Treaty says that all NATO members have an obligation to come to the defense of other NATO members, but that obligation doesn't exist for states outside the alliance. And so that's why there isn't an obligation to come to the aid of Ukraine. There might be a right or permission, sort of something that Professor Oosterveld was getting at, under the framework of collective self-defense, if Ukraine were to invite them in, if Ukraine were to request the assistance of other states, but there's no obligation to engage in the war for states outside the NATO alliance, and there's no obligation under the UN, the EU Charter to do so. Yeah, so hopefully.
Thank you. Professor Ditchok, do you have anything to add about that kind of escalation?
Absolutely. I don't know how many of you read the New York Times. There's a really interesting piece by David Milburn, today's paper, Britain's former foreign secretary, foreign minister, where he writes about the fact that Ukraine presents a moral crisis, not just a military one. And that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is threatening the military balance of power in Europe, but also the moral balance, that the West has values, and this is the moment to show if it can live up to those values and defend them. And Putin's willingness to challenge international norms is right now. Ukrainians are being killed, but these values are being killed as well if nothing is done. So this conversation today is really interesting for me, because for me this is a moment where legal norms and moral issues have to be put in conversation, because a number of people from Ukraine are saying, well, yeah, NATO's defending itself, but they're letting us be killed. So what does that say about universal values?
I also have so much to say, but I'm not going to, because I'm just moderating today. So let me invite each of the three of you. We're running out of time. People have to scramble for class and other things. I'm going to start with Professor Liss. I'll come to Professor Oosterveld, and I'll end with Professor Ditchok. Let me just ask, is there something you'd like to add, something that we've talked about today that you'd like to either reinforce or something you haven't had a chance to mention? Professor Liss, over to you.
Yeah, so and this picks up on kind of many of the questions that we've talked about today, and that's the one piece of the puzzle that we haven't gotten into in depth, but it's kind of been in the background, is the role of sanctions in the ongoing crisis. And part of the kind of legal story, at least, it might be distinct from the moral one, but part of the legal story about the prohibition on force that came into play in 1928 and was crystallized in 1945 was that we got rid of the use of war as a means of enforcing the law. And it was replaced with basically two things. One I mentioned earlier, which is the exercise of collective security under the UN Charter. So now we don't go to war individually as states, but we have a kind of collective regime that does so. And the other thing was the use of what's called what some scholars have referred to as outcasting as a means of enforcement. So basically restraining engagement with the kind of collaborative exercise of international relations as a means of punishment. So we enforce by removing the ability of states to engage in the kind of collaborative gains they get from international relations. And so the thought in at that moment in time was that, you know, we move away from a regime of law enforced by force and one that's enforced by this kind of outcasting and sanctions regime. And this, in some ways, is kind of one of the most dramatic instances of seeing that actually come to play. We've seen more significant sanctions than have ever been applied, and a quicker framework, a quicker pattern of enforcement than we've ever seen before. It remains to see kind of how effective that is as a means of deterrence and prevention and secession. But it still is interesting to see the role that that's playing in the framework of enforcing modern international law.
Thank you. The role of diplomacy in all of this is really interesting to think about too. Professor Oosterveld, over to you, and then to Professor Ditchok, please.
Sure. I just want to build on what my colleague, Professor Liss, just said, because I think that we've talked about two legal responses. There are, of course, many political responses that should and could happen, but let me just focus on the legal because I'm a law professor. We've talked about the ICJ, we've talked about the ICC, we've talked about the use of sanctions, but there have been some interesting discussions in the legal field over the last several days about using every single possible tribunal looking at treaties to which Russia is a part, in business, in human rights, in the law of the sea, in environmental law, and using those to the best advantage possible. So it's a non-forcible response, and it could be much even larger than it has been so far.
Thank you. I think too about the NHL, about FIFA, about other, it's not just tribunals that can be used, there can be pressure applied. Professor Ditchok, last comment to you.
Building on that, we are intellectuals, we are scholars, we are students. We can't do anything at the UN level, we can do something at our own level, at the university level. We as the community of scholars, and thanks Professor Quinn for organizing this, inform ourselves. We seek out information, we write about things, we disseminate things. So I think that's where we can have an impact. And the other thing, as a community, Western University could be doing something to help students, to help scholars. And that's something for us to think about. Again, Professor Quinn, we've been in touch with me about this Scholars at Risk program, but I think helping one scholar is great, but if we can reach out to an entire university that we already have an established relationship with, university to university level, and say, what do you need? How can we help you? Reach out to expand, open the door to student exchanges the way that Canada has opened its door to refugees, to sort of streamline that process to say, okay, students who want to come and study, because some of those instruments are in place, but they move slowly. So this is the time to pick it up quickly. And as individuals, you can reach out to any of these people that I've mentioned or other people and just say, hey.
Thank you. I want to say first, thank you to our audience members. It's so nice to see so many of you, friends, old and new, students, former students. We're grateful for you grateful to you for engaging with us. I also want to be sure to thank our three presenters, Professor Marta Ditchok, Professor Ryan Liss, Professor Valerie Oosterveld. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your time. Behind the scenes is Sam Gabrai, our tech expert and PhD student extraordinaire. Sam, thank you for this. We have recorded today's session. We'll be posting it under the Speakers Series videos on our website. And if you need anything from us, please email me at tjcenter@uwo.ca. We'll also be continuing to take your questions and continuing to engage on this issue. So once again, thank you very, very much. And hopefully we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.
Thank you.